In September 1966, a group of American officers gathered at the May CV Recondo School in Nha Trang
So the main
watched
force will move
something
into the
that didn't
objective
make
area
sense to
and
them.
establish a
An
secure perimeter.
Australian SAS instructor was teaching a course on long-range reconnaissance patrol techniques, and everything he described contradicted what they'd been taught.
Now,
He
radio
spoke about
silence means
patrols
exactly
that
that.
moved
No
less than a
transmissions
kilometer
whatsoever
per
for the
day.
entire
He
72-hour
explained
period you're in that
radio
ambush
silence
position.
protocols that lasted for days. I described ambush positions that teams held for 72 hours without moving. One American captain raised his hand. "Sir, with all due respect, how do you complete your mission if you're barely moving?" The Australian looked at him for a long moment before answering. "We don't complete missions, we win wars." The room went silent. Nobody understood what he meant. Not yet, but they would. Because over the next 5 years, the Australian SAS would achieve something no other unit in Vietnam could match. A kill ratio so unprecedented that historians would spend decades trying to explain it. And the Americans who witnessed it firsthand would come to realize that everything they thought they knew about jungle warfare was wrong. The doctrine that divided allies. When the first Australian troops arrived in Vietnam in 1965, attached to the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade at Bien Hoa, the differences became apparent immediately. The Australians moved differently, they patrolled differently, they fought differently. American commanders watched with a mixture of curiosity and frustration as their Commonwealth allies seemed to deliberately ignore every tactical principle the U.S. military had developed. Where American units moved with speed and aggression, the Australians crept. Where Americans called in artillery and airstrikes at the first sign of contact, the Australians held their fire. Where American patrols covered maximum ground to find the enemy, Australian patrols barely seemed to move at all. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, which had been in-country since 1962, had already been causing friction. These highly experienced advisors, many veterans of the Malayan emergency, openly questioned American tactics. Colonel Ted Sarong, who led the team, had famously challenged U.S. Marine General Victor Krulak at a counterinsurgency group meeting in Washington, expressing doubt about the strategic Hamlet program. It wasn't just skepticism, it was a fundamental disagreement about how to fight a counterinsurgency war. The Americans had come to Vietnam with a doctrine forged in World War II and refined in Korea. It emphasized firepower, mobility, and aggressive pursuit of the enemy. Search and destroy operations sent large units sweeping through territory to locate enemy forces, then hammered them with overwhelming firepower, artillery barrages, close air support, helicopter gunships, B-52 strikes that turned jungle into moonscape. The philosophy was simple and American. Find them, fix them, destroy them. It had worked against the Japanese. It had worked against the Chinese and North Koreans. It would work against the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army. Except it wasn't working. Not really. The enemy adapted quickly. Vietnamese communist forces learned the pattern, engage briefly, inflict casualties, break contact when you hear the helicopters coming, fade into the jungle before the artillery arrives. By the time American firepower reached the contact area, the target was gone. The Americans were winning tactical engagements, but losing strategic ground. Body counts went up, but the enemy kept coming. Something was fundamentally wrong with the approach, but the U.S. military establishment wasn't ready to admit it. Then came the Australians, with their maddeningly slow patrols and their refusal to use firepower as a first resort. American officers complained that Australian units weren't clearing areas fast enough. They weren't aggressive enough. They weren't American enough. But there was something the Americans weren't seeing yet, something that would only become clear when the Australian Special Air Service Regiment arrived in Vietnam in June 1966 and began operations that would redefine what special operations could achieve in counterinsurgency warfare, the birth of a regiment. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment had a short but intensive history before Vietnam. Formed on July 25, 1957, at Campbell Barracks in Swanbourne, Western Australia, it was modeled directly on the British SAS that had proven so effective during the Malayan Emergency. The British had shown that small, highly trained teams could dominate vast areas of jungle through stealth, patience, and precision. The Australians took those lessons and built on them. Initially established as a company within the Royal Australian Regiment, the unit expanded to regiment status on September 14, 1964, just in time for its first real test. That test came in Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation. From February 1965 to late 1966, Australian SAS squadrons rotated through the dense jungles of Sarawak, conducting reconnaissance patrols and secret cross-border operations into Indonesian Kalimantan. It was in Borneo that the regiment learned the techniques that would make them legendary in Vietnam. How to move through jungle so slowly that you became part of it. How to set ambushes that the enemy walked into without ever knowing you were there. How to gather intelligence by watching rather than fighting. How to survive for weeks in hostile territory with minimal support. The Borneo operations taught them that success in jungle warfare wasn't about firepower or speed. It was about patience, discipline, and an almost supernatural ability to remain invisible. When 3 Squadron SAS arrived at Vung Tau on June 16, 1966, and moved to Nui Dat the next day, they brought with them lessons learned not just in Borneo, but from decades of Commonwealth jungle warfare experience. The regiment's senior NCOs were veterans of the Malayan Emergency, where they'd fought Chinese communist guerrillas for 12 years in conditions remarkably similar to Vietnam. They understood something fundamental that the Americans, with all their technological superiority and firepower, had not yet grasped. In jungle warfare, the side that sees first wins, and seeing first means moving so slowly, so carefully, so silently, that you become invisible while your enemy announces his presence with every step. The Phantom operations begin. The SAS operational doctrine in Vietnam was straightforward in concept, but extraordinarily difficult in execution. 5-man patrols would be inserted by helicopter into enemy-controlled territory. They would then disappear. For days or weeks at a time, these tiny teams would move through areas where enemy forces operated freely, gathering intelligence, setting ambushes, and eliminating targets with surgical precision. Then they would extract, and another patrol would take their place. The American long-range reconnaissance patrol units, when they first observed SAS operations, couldn't believe what they were seeing. The Australian patrols moved at a pace that seemed impossibly slow. A team might cover less than a kilometer in an entire day. They stopped every few hundred meters and sat absolutely motionless for 30 minutes or more, just watching and listening. Every piece of metal equipment was wrapped in tape or cloth to prevent noise. They mixed mud and dirt into their uniforms to eliminate shine. They didn't smoke. They didn't cook hot meals. They communicated in whispers or hand signals for weeks. The level of noise discipline was unlike anything American forces had attempted. U.S. LRRP teams were good, but they still made noise. Equipment rattled, men coughed, someone would step on a branch. The Australians had elevated silent movement to an art form. They practiced it until it became second nature. A former SAS trooper described it in a post-war interview. You learn to feel the ground before you put your weight down. You learn to move branches aside so slowly they didn't bounce back. You learn to control your breathing, your movement, everything. After a few weeks in the bush, you moved like smoke. The patience required was extraordinary. American doctrine emphasized aggressive action. Get in, complete the mission, get out. The SAS would spend 3 days getting into position for a 30-second ambush. They would watch an enemy base camp for a week, cataloging movements and positions, then report the intelligence and extract without firing a shot. They would follow enemy units for days, learning their patterns before setting up an ambush at the perfect location and time. The psychological effect on the enemy was devastating. Vietnamese communist forces had learned how to deal with American operations. They knew the patterns. They knew the sounds. They knew when to hide and when to fight. But they had no counter for an enemy they couldn't detect. Former Viet Cong fighters, interviewed decades after the war, described the fear. You'd be moving supplies down a trail you'd used safely for months. Suddenly, your point man would drop without a sound. Then another. Then automatic weapons fire would erupt from positions you'd walked past without seeing anything. The engagement would last 60 seconds. Then silence. When reinforcements arrived minutes later, they'd find bodies, but no trace of who killed them. No spent brass casings, no blood trails, no footprints, just empty jungle. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle. It wasn't a nickname born of respect. It was born of terror. A former female Viet Cong fighter, in a 2015 documentary interview, spoke words that captured this fear perfectly. We were not afraid of the American GIs, Australian infantry, or even B-52 bombing. We hated the Australian SAS Rangers because they make comrades disappear. Not killed in battle, not dying in firefights that could be understood and avenged, just gone, erased. The not knowing was worse than the dying. The Americans watch and learn. The U.S. military's relationship with the Australian SAS began with skepticism and ended with imitation. In September 1966, just 3 months after the first Australian SAS squadron deployed to Vietnam, personnel from 3 Squadron began teaching at the MICV Recondo School at Nha Trang. This school, established by General Westmoreland to train American and Allied forces in long-range reconnaissance patrol techniques, was run by Ranger-qualified instructors from the 5th Special Forces Group. The Australians arrived as liaison instructors, bringing their combat experience from Borneo and their first months in Vietnam. What they taught challenged everything the American students thought they knew about reconnaissance operations. The Americans had been taught to move fast, cover ground, gather information, and report back. The Australians taught something different. They taught patience as a weapon. They taught that moving slowly was faster than moving fast if it meant you survived to complete the mission. They taught that watching for 3 days could yield more intelligence than 3 weeks of active patrolling. They taught that sometimes the best action was no action at all. At first, many American students resisted. The techniques seemed counterintuitive. How could you dominate an area by barely moving through it? How could you gather good intelligence if you only covered a few hundred meters per day? How could you call it a successful patrol if you didn't even make contact with the enemy? But then the reports started coming in from Viet Cong Province, where the Australian SAS was operating. The kill ratios were incredible. Patrols were eliminating enemy soldiers at a rate no other unit could match, and doing it with almost no friendly casualties. American long-range reconnaissance patrol units began paying closer attention to what the Australians were teaching. Some LRRP teams were attached to Australian SAS squadrons to observe their operations firsthand. What they saw changed how they thought about reconnaissance warfare. An American LRRP from the 101st Airborne Division described his first patrol with an Australian SAS team. "We thought we were good. Then we spent 2 weeks with the Aussies and realized we'd been crashing through the jungle like a herd of elephants. These guys moved like they were part of the trees. I watched one of them freeze in mid-step for 10 minutes because he heard something. Just stood there, balanced on one foot, not moving a muscle. Then he slowly lowered his foot, and we all froze for another 20 minutes. Turned out there was a VC patrol 200 meters away. They walked right past us, never knew we were there." The May-Pa-Vi Recondo School became a conduit for Australian tactics to flow into American reconnaissance units. Over the school's existence from 1966 to 1971, 18 Australian personnel graduated from the course, but more importantly, Australian instructors taught thousands of American students. The school itself was demanding, with a failure rate of 50%. It combined classroom instruction with practical training that pushed students to their absolute limits. The final exam was an actual combat patrol in enemy territory. Students who failed that patrol didn't graduate. The Australians brought a level of professionalism and combat experience that impressed even the most hardened American Special Forces instructors. The curriculum they influenced covered everything from movement techniques to ambush planning to survival skills. But what made the Australian contribution unique was their emphasis on patience as a tactical weapon. They taught students to think in terms of days rather than hours, to plan operations that might take a week to set up for a 30-second engagement, to understand that the best patrol was often one where you never made contact with the enemy because you saw them first and let them pass. American students found this approach challenging. Their training had emphasized aggressive action, find the enemy, close with the enemy, destroy the enemy. The Australian approach was more nuanced. Observe the enemy, understand the enemy. Choose when and whether to engage the enemy based on tactical advantage. It required a completely different mindset. Some students grasped it immediately and became outstanding reconnaissance operators. Others struggled with the concept throughout the course. The influence was profound. American LRRP units began adopting Australian techniques: slower movement, better noise discipline, longer observation periods, less reliance on immediate firepower. Teams that had been conducting 3-day patrols extended them to 5 or 7 days. Teams that had been moving several kilometers per day slowed down to cover hundreds of meters. Teams that had been engaging targets of opportunity learned to watch and report instead. The success rate of American reconnaissance operations improved dramatically. Mission completion rates went up. Intelligence quality improved. Casualty rates went down. American LRRP teams that adopted Australian methods found themselves surviving longer and accomplishing more. But there was a problem. The American military machine wasn't designed to support operations the way the Australians conducted them. U.S. doctrine still emphasized speed and firepower. American helicopter pilots were trained for quick insertions and extractions, not the careful, deceptive approaches the Australians preferred. They would insert teams with gunships blazing, announcing to every enemy unit in the area that Americans were on the ground. The Australians preferred subtle insertions, multiple helicopters flying different directions, false insertions to confuse the enemy, actual insertions done so quickly and quietly that observers wouldn't know which helicopter had dropped off a team. American artillery was positioned to support large unit operations, not the tiny teams the SAS was fielding. Fire support coordination that worked perfectly for the Australians in Viet Cong Province, where artillery was specifically positioned to cover SAS patrol areas, was much harder to replicate across the rest of Vietnam, where artillery was supporting conventional infantry operations. The Australians had built their entire tactical framework around small unit operations. Everything from their command structure to their logistics to their training was designed to support this approach. Their artillery at Nui Dat was positioned specifically to support SAS patrols operating throughout Viet Cong Province. Fire support coordinators worked constantly with SAS patrol leaders to pre-plan artillery targets. Before a patrol even inserted, likely ambush sites would be surveyed and artillery coordinates calculated. If a patrol made contact, artillery could be falling on the enemy within 60 seconds. The gunners at Nui Dat developed such proficiency that they could walk artillery to within 50 meters of friendly forces with confidence. This kind of precision required constant communication between the patrols and the fire support base, exceptional map-reading skills, and gunners who understood that Australian lives depended on their accuracy. Their helicopter crews from 9 Squadron RAF trained constantly with the SAS, developing an almost telepathic understanding of how to insert and extract teams without compromising their positions. The pilots learned to fly in ways that American helicopter pilots considered reckless. They would hug terrain at dangerous altitudes. They would approach landing zones from unexpected directions. They would perform false insertions, touching down briefly in multiple locations to confuse enemy observers about where the actual team had been dropped. They developed hand signals and radio procedures that allowed split-second coordination. An SAS patrol commander could guide a helicopter to an emergency extraction landing zone he'd never seen before, using nothing but terrain features and compass bearings, and the pilot would find it. This level of trust and capability came from hundreds of hours of training together. The SAS and 9 Squadron personnel lived on the same base. They socialized together. They trained together constantly. They understood each other's capabilities and limitations intimately. The bond between 9 Squadron and the SAS became legendary throughout the Australian forces in Vietnam. Pilots would fly in conditions that American helicopter crews refused to attempt: thick fog, heavy rain, poor visibility. If an SAS patrol needed extraction, 9 Squadron would find a way to get them out. They would execute insertions that looked impossible to outside observers, landing in clearings that seemed too small, approaching under fire, hovering while teams fast roped in or scrambled aboard. They would extract teams under fire with a precision that left American observers stunned. The pilots knew that hesitation or mistakes could cost Australian lives, so they didn't hesitate, and they didn't make mistakes. The SAS teams knew that no matter how bad their situation became, 9 Squadron would come for them. That confidence allowed them to operate more aggressively, knowing that if everything went wrong, they had the best helicopter support in Vietnam backing them up. The Americans had the equipment and the capability to conduct operations the Australian way. American helicopters were as good or better than what the Australians flew. American artillery was more powerful and more numerous. American reconnaissance troops were brave and capable. What they lacked was the institutional commitment to completely rethinking their doctrine. The entire American military establishment in Vietnam was built around a different philosophy. Large units, overwhelming firepower, aggressive pursuit of the enemy, quick in and quick out. To adopt the Australian approach would have required changing everything from command structures to logistics to training to the way units communicated with each other. It would have required patience from commanders who were under political pressure to show results quickly. It would have required accepting fewer dramatic victories in exchange for steady, grinding success. It would have required trusting small teams to make tactical decisions instead of directing every action from headquarters. And so, while American LRRP units became more effective by adopting some Australian techniques, the U.S. military as a whole continued to fight the war the American way, with firepower, with speed, with aggression, and with casualties that kept mounting. The numbers don't lie. Between 1966 and 1971, the Australian SAS conducted nearly 1,200 patrols in Viet Cong Province and surrounding areas. The statistics that emerged from these operations were unprecedented. Over 600 enemy soldiers confirmed killed, 1 SAS trooper killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidental deaths, 1 missing, 1 death from illness, 28 wounded in action. The kill ratio was astronomical, more than 100 to 1. No other unit in the entire Vietnam War came close to matching it. These weren't just statistics. Each number represented a carefully planned and flawlessly executed operation, a patrol that spent days getting into position, hours of absolute stillness waiting for the perfect moment, 30 seconds of controlled violence that eliminated the target before anyone knew what was happening. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The real impact of the Australian SAS went beyond body counts. They created a zone of uncertainty throughout Viet Cong Province that fundamentally changed how the enemy operated. Captured Viet Cong documents from 1967 and 1968 specifically warned units about Australian SAS operations. These documents, recovered from dead enemy soldiers or captured base camps, provided a window into how the enemy viewed different Allied forces. The documents were chilling in their assessment. For American forces, the guidance was tactical and detailed. Use these techniques to ambush them. They rely heavily on helicopter support, so prepare anti-aircraft positions. They call in artillery immediately, so prepare to break contact quickly. They move in large groups, so you can hear them coming from far away. For Australian infantry, the guidance was operational and cautious. Avoid these areas when they're patrolling. They are more dangerous than Americans because they move slowly and carefully. They do not reveal their positions easily. Their ambushes are well planned and difficult to escape. Be especially careful when moving through areas they control. For the SAS, the guidance was simple and terrifying. Avoid contact if possible. If contact is unavoidable, assume you are already under observation. Assume they know your positions and strength. Assume reinforcement has been called before the first shot is fired. Assume artillery has been pre-plotted on your position. Assume they have been watching you for days and know your routines. Assume withdrawal routes are covered by additional teams. The level of fear in these documents was palpable. One captured instruction manual included this passage. The Australian SAS reconnaissance teams are the most dangerous enemy we face. They do not patrol like other forces. They become part of the jungle. You will not see them, you will not hear them. The first indication of their presence will be when your soldiers begin to fall. By then, it is too late. If you believe an SAS team is in your area, assume they have already observed you. Change all your routines, move your camp immediately. Cancel all supply movements. Even then, you may not be safe. That last assumption reveals the psychological warfare the SAS waged without intending. 2. They'd created such effective ambushes with artillery support called in so precisely and reinforcements arriving so quickly that the enemy assumed they were always being watched. Every trail became suspect. Every jungle clearing could conceal an SAS patrol. Every supply movement risked walking into an ambush that had been prepared days in advance. The SAS didn't need to be everywhere. They just needed the enemy to believe they might be anywhere. And the enemy did believe it. The psychological impact went beyond simple fear. It created operational paralysis. Enemy commanders couldn't move forces freely without worrying about SAS observation. They couldn't establish permanent base camps without fear of them being compromised. They couldn't run supply routes on regular schedules because predictability meant death. Enemy units that had operated freely in Viet Cong Province for years began showing signs of extreme caution. Movement slowed dramatically. Units that used to move during daylight switched to night movement, which made them slower and more vulnerable to accidents. Supply runs that used to follow the same trails and schedules became irregular and unpredictable, which made logistics much harder. Base camps that had been in place for months or years were relocated constantly, which disrupted training and operations. Communications became more guarded because they knew the Australians had signals intelligence. Even personal behavior changed. Enemy soldiers became reluctant to light fires or smoke, even in supposedly secure areas. They spoke in whispers. They looked over their shoulders constantly. The entire enemy command structure in the province operated under perpetual uncertainty. And that uncertainty, that constant state of alert and fear, degraded their combat effectiveness more than any number of search and destroy operations could have achieved. Former Viet Cong commanders, interviewed after the war, admitted that the Australian SAS had a disproportionate effect on their operations. One senior officer explained, "We could plan for American operations. We knew when they were coming. We knew how they would move. We knew when to engage and when to withdraw. But the Australian SAS teams, we never knew where they were. A unit commander could not tell his men that an area was safe because he didn't know. And when they struck, it was always at the moment of maximum vulnerability. This operational impact went beyond what body counts could measure. The SAS wasn't just killing enemy soldiers, they were killing enemy confidence. They were creating an environment where the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces couldn't move freely in their own territory, where supply lines became tenuous, where base camps became temporary, where every movement carried the risk of walking into an ambush set by an enemy you'd never see. The battle that proved everything. On August 18, 1966, 2 months after the first Australian SAS squadron arrived in Vietnam, a battle occurred that would demonstrate the superiority of Australian tactical doctrine in a way that even skeptical American officers couldn't ignore. It wasn't an SAS operation, it was a conventional infantry engagement, but it proved that the Australian approach to warfare in Vietnam, the approach the Americans had been questioning, worked. The Battle of Long Tan started when D Company, 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, moved into a rubber plantation east of Nui Dat to investigate enemy firing positions from a mortar attack the previous night. 108 men, 3 platoons, 1 company headquarters, a New Zealand artillery forward observer team. They walked into a force of at least 1,500 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army soldiers, possibly as many as 2,500. By every conventional measure, D Company should have been destroyed. They were outnumbered at least 15-1. They had no armor support initially, no air support because of the weather. They were in an exposed position in a rubber plantation with limited cover. The enemy had them surrounded and was conducting human wave assaults designed to overwhelm their position through sheer numbers. But D Company had something the enemy couldn't counter. They had training that emphasized individual marksmanship and fire discipline. They had officers and NCOs who could coordinate their platoons even when communications were degraded. They had artillery support from Nui Dat that could be directed with devastating precision. And they had the tactical doctrine developed through years of counterinsurgency warfare in Malaya, refined in Borneo, and perfected in the first months of operations in Vietnam. The fighting lasted over 3 hours. D Company established a defensive perimeter and held it through repeated assaults. They controlled their fire, taking aimed shots instead of spraying bullets. They called in artillery support that landed danger close, within 100 meters of their position, because the forward observers were skilled enough and the gunners were disciplined enough to make it work. When their ammunition ran low, RAF helicopters from 9 Squadron flew through monsoon weather at treetop height to drop supplies directly to the besieged company. When reinforcements finally arrived, armored personnel carriers from A Company pushing through enemy forces to reach D Company's position, the Viet Cong broke contact and withdrew. The next morning, Australian forces swept through the battlefield and found 245 enemy dead. D Company had lost 18 killed and 24 wounded. The casualties were devastating to the small unit, but by any military standard, they had won a decisive victory against overwhelming odds. American observers were stunned. A U.S. artillery officer who had coordinated some of the fire support described it as the most professional infantry action he'd seen in Vietnam. The coordination between infantry, artillery, and helicopter support had been flawless. The discipline under fire had been extraordinary. The tactical decisions made by Company Commander Major Harry Smith had been textbook perfect. What the Americans were seeing was the result of a completely different approach to training and doctrine. The Australians didn't train their soldiers to rely on overwhelming firepower. They trained them to fight as a coordinated team, even when outnumbered and surrounded. They didn't train them to call for airstrikes at the first sign of trouble. They trained them to use artillery with surgical precision. They didn't train them to spray and pray. They trained them to make every shot count. The Battle of Long Tan demonstrated that Australian tactical doctrine wasn't just effective for special operations. It worked for conventional infantry as well. It worked so well that even in the worst possible situation, heavily outnumbered in open terrain against a determined enemy, Australian forces could not just survive, but win decisively. American military leadership in Vietnam took notice. Some began to question whether the American approach, with its emphasis on firepower and attrition, was the most effective way to fight this particular war. But institutional momentum is hard to change. The U.S. military machine was too large, too committed to its doctrine, and too politically invested in its strategy to make fundamental changes. The war would continue to be fought primarily the American way, even as some units quietly adopted techniques learned from their Australian allies. The wider Australian approach. The Australian SAS wasn't operating in isolation. They were part of a larger Australian military commitment in Vietnam that approached the war fundamentally differently than the Americans. When the first Australian task force was established at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province in April 1966, it operated under a different strategic concept than American forces. The Australians had been given their own province to secure. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate decision made after operations in 1965 had highlighted the differences between Australian and American operational methods. Australian and U.S. military leaders agreed that Australian combat forces should be deployed in a discrete province where they could, as one Australian general put it, fight their own tactical war. That war looked different than the American war happening in the rest of South Vietnam, where American forces conducted large-scale search and destroy operations. Australian forces conducted constant, small-unit patrolling. Where Americans cleared areas and moved on, Australians stayed and held ground. Where Americans relied heavily on firepower, Australians relied more on patrolling, ambushes, and small-unit tactics. The Australian base at Nui Dat was run differently than American bases. Unlike many American installations located near populated areas, Nui Dat was cleared of Vietnamese civilians. No local nationals were allowed on base, except under strict supervision. This meant enemy intelligence couldn't easily determine troop strength or disposition. It also meant better base security. The Australians could control their perimeter absolutely. Australian infantry battalions patrolled constantly. Platoons would spend days or weeks in the bush, moving through their area of operations, setting ambushes, tracking enemy movement, denying the Viet Cong the freedom to operate. It was exhausting, unglamorous work, but it was effective. Over time, Phuoc Tuy Province became increasingly difficult for enemy forces to operate in. Supply routes were interdicted. Base camps were discovered and destroyed. The local population, seeing that the Australians weren't going anywhere, became less willing to support the Viet Cong. The Australian approach had been developed during the Malayan Emergency, where Commonwealth forces had spent 12 years defeating a communist insurgency. The lessons learned there had been codified in Australian military doctrine. Counterinsurgency required patience. It required constant presence. It required winning the population's confidence through security, not through grand gestures or temporary operations. American officers sometimes criticized Australian tactics as too slow, not aggressive enough. Why weren't they clearing larger areas? Why weren't they conducting more ambitious operations? Why did they patrol the same areas repeatedly instead of sweeping through and moving on? The Australians answered with results. Phuoc Tuy Province, while never completely pacified, became one of the more secure areas in South Vietnam. The Viet Cong infrastructure there was systematically degraded. Major enemy operations in the province became increasingly rare. The population, while never enthusiastic about any foreign military presence, became more cooperative as security improved. It was slow, it was methodical, it wasn't dramatic, but it worked. The influence spreads. As the war progressed, American units began quietly adopting more Australian-style tactics. It happened gradually, unit by unit, often through personal relationships rather than official doctrine changes. American advisors who worked with Australian forces brought techniques back to their units. LRRP teams that trained with Australian SAS incorporated their methods. Infantry officers who observed Australian operations adapted what they'd seen to their own situations. The changes were subtle but significant. American patrols began moving more slowly and carefully. Ambushes were set with more patience. Fire discipline improved. There was more emphasis on stealth and less reliance on immediate firepower. The reconnaissance community was most influenced by Australian methods. American LRRP and Ranger units adopted many SAS techniques wholesale. The way they moved, the way they established observation posts, the way they planned and executed ambushes. The results spoke for themselves as American reconnaissance operations became more effective. But the influence couldn't spread throughout the entire U.S. military effort in Vietnam. The American war machine was too large and too committed to its existing doctrine. Division and corps-level operations continued to emphasize firepower and attrition. Search and destroy missions continued on a large scale. B-52 strikes continued to pound suspected enemy positions. The strategy remained fundamentally unchanged. Some American military thinkers recognized the disconnect. They understood that the Australian approach was achieving better results with fewer resources. But changing doctrine in the middle of a war, especially when that war was becoming increasingly unpopular at home, was politically and institutionally impossible. The United States would continue to fight the war its way, even as evidence mounted that there might be a better approach. The Australians, meanwhile, continued their methodical campaign in Viet Cong Province. The SAS continued their phantom operations, creating uncertainty and fear throughout enemy-controlled areas. Infantry battalions continued their constant patrolling. The kill ratios remained extraordinarily favorable. The casualty rates remained remarkably low. By 1970, when Australia began withdrawing forces from Vietnam, the Australian military had demonstrated that a different approach to counterinsurgency warfare was not just viable but potentially more effective than the American strategy. They'd done it with a fraction of the resources. They'd done it with fewer casualties. They'd done it by fighting smart instead of fighting big. The long shadow. The Vietnam War ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon. The United States withdrew in defeat, having failed to achieve its strategic objectives despite overwhelming military superiority. The reasons for that failure are complex and debated to this day. Poor strategy, political constraints, lack of understanding of the enemy, failure to address the underlying political and social issues. But one factor that often gets overlooked is tactical doctrine. The American military fought the war it knew how to fight, not necessarily the war that needed to be fought. Large-scale operations, heavy firepower, attrition warfare, body counts. These tactics had worked in previous conflicts, but they weren't working in Vietnam. The enemy adapted. They developed tactics specifically designed to counter American strengths. They would engage briefly, inflict casualties, then withdraw before American firepower could be brought to bear. They fought at times and places of their choosing. They used the population as cover. They moved freely through supposedly secure areas. American forces were winning tactical engagements but losing strategic ground. The Australians demonstrated an alternative approach: small unit tactics, patient patrolling, emphasis on intelligence gathering, use of stealth over firepower, building local security through constant presence rather than large operations. In their area of operations, this approach worked, not perfectly, not completely, but measurably better than what was happening in American-controlled areas. The Australian SAS specifically showed what highly trained, properly employed special operations forces could achieve. They created an environment where the enemy couldn't move freely. They gathered intelligence that led to successful operations. They eliminated key targets with minimal civilian casualties. They did all this with remarkably few friendly casualties. Their methods proved that in counterinsurgency warfare, quality matters more than quantity. Training matters more than firepower. Patience matters more than aggression. The lessons weren't fully learned at the time. The American military was too focused on fighting the current war to step back and fundamentally reassess its approach. Some units learned, some officers understood, but institutional change happened slowly, especially during a losing war. It took years after Vietnam for the American military to seriously study counterinsurgency warfare, to develop doctrine that emphasized winning the population rather than just killing the enemy, to train special operations forces to think strategically rather than just tactically, to understand that in irregular warfare the enemy you don't have to fight because he surrendered or changed sides is more valuable than the enemy you kill. Many of those lessons came from studying what had worked in Vietnam, and what had worked, despite the overall failure, was the Australian approach in Viet Cong Province. The Australian SAS in particular became a model for how special operations forces should operate in counterinsurgency environments. Modern special operations doctrine bears the fingerprints of those Australian SAS operations in Vietnam. The emphasis on small teams operating independently, the focus on intelligence gathering and precision strikes rather than large-scale destruction, the understanding that sometimes the best action is patience, the recognition that causing fear and uncertainty in the enemy can be as effective as killing him. These weren't new concepts. The British SAS had pioneered many of them, but it was the Australian SAS in Vietnam that proved they could work in a modern counterinsurgency war. That demonstrated the techniques could be systematized, taught, and replicated. That showed skeptical American officers that there was another way to fight, the final accounting. When the last Australian SAS squadron withdrew from Vietnam in October 1971, they left behind a record that has never been matched. Nearly 1,200 patrols conducted, over 600 confirmed enemy killed, hundreds more probably killed or wounded, countless intelligence reports that led to successful operations, and casualties so low they barely register in the statistics of a war that killed over 58,000 Americans and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese. The numbers are impressive, but they don't capture what the Australian SAS really achieved in Vietnam. They created a new model for special operations in counterinsurgency warfare. They proved that small units of highly trained soldiers, properly employed with the right tactics, could achieve strategic effects far beyond their size. They demonstrated that in jungle warfare, patience and stealth were more valuable than firepower and speed. They showed that in counterinsurgency, killing the enemy was less important than controlling the environment he operated in. The American troops, who didn't understand Australian SAS strategy at first, eventually learned to respect it. The LRRP teams that trained alongside them adopted their techniques. The officers who observed their operations recognized their effectiveness. The helicopter pilots who supported them developed deep respect for their professionalism. Even enemy fighters interviewed decades later spoke of them with a mixture of fear and grudging admiration. The Australian SAS didn't win the Vietnam War. No unit could have done that. The war was lost for reasons far beyond tactical effectiveness, political failure, strategic confusion, lack of clear objectives. These doomed the overall effort regardless of how well individual units performed. But in their small corner of the war, the Australian SAS showed what victory could look like. They showed that with the right approach, the right training, and the right mindset, even a small force could dominate a much larger enemy. The lessons they taught at the MACV Recondo School in 1966 eventually spread throughout the Special Operations community. The techniques they pioneered influenced how modern special forces operate. The standard they set for professionalism, discipline, and effectiveness remains a benchmark for elite units around the world. When that Australian instructor stood in front of a room full of skeptical American officers in September 1966 and said, "We don't complete missions, we win wars," he was stating something that would take years for others to understand. Completing a mission means achieving an objective. Winning a war means creating conditions where the enemy can no longer fight effectively. The Australian SAS in Vietnam didn't just kill enemy soldiers, they created an environment where those soldiers couldn't operate freely, where supply lines became tenuous, where movement carried constant risk, where even in their own territory, enemy forces had to operate with the knowledge that they might be being watched by an invisible enemy who would strike without warning. That's not just completing missions, that's winning a war, one small patrol at a time. The American troops, who eventually understood this, who learned from their Australian allies and adapted their tactics, became more effective soldiers. The ones who didn't, who remained committed to fighting the war the American way with American methods, learned harder lessons. But the Australian SAS left Vietnam knowing they'd done something remarkable. They'd fought the most effective campaign of the war. They'd achieved kill ratios that would be considered unbelievable if they weren't so thoroughly documented. They'd earned the respect of their allies and the fear of their enemies. And they'd proven that sometimes the quietest soldiers are the most deadly. The legacy of the Australian SAS in Vietnam extends far beyond the statistics and the stories. It lives on in modern special operations doctrine, in the training programs that elite units use, in the tactics that are taught to new generations of soldiers. It lives on in the respect that veterans of that war, on both sides, still express when they talk about the phantoms of the jungle. And it lives on in the understanding, hard-won through 5 years of operations in the most challenging environment imaginable, that in counterinsurgency warfare, the most powerful weapon isn't the biggest bomb or the fastest helicopter. It's the patient, disciplined, invisible soldier who watches and waits and strikes at the perfect moment, then disappears back into the jungle like smoke. That was the strategy American troops didn't understand at first. By the time they did understand it, by the time they recognized its effectiveness and tried to adopt it themselves, the war was already lost, but the lessons remained. And in future conflicts, in future counterinsurgencies, those lessons would prove invaluable. The Australian SAS won their war in Vietnam, even as the larger war was being lost around them. They won it by refusing to fight the way everyone expected them to fight, by moving slower when everyone said move faster, by staying silent when everyone said make noise, by watching patiently when everyone said take action. They won it by understanding something fundamental about jungle warfare that took American forces years to learn. The side that sees first wins. And to see first, you have to be invisible. You have to become the jungle. You have to transform yourself from a soldier crashing through the bush into a phantom that the enemy never knows is there until it's too late. That transformation, that complete rethinking of how to conduct military operations in counterinsurgency environments, was what the Australian SAS brought to Vietnam. And while it couldn't save a war that was lost for strategic and political reasons, it saved countless lives and proved that there was a better way. The American troops who learned that lesson carried it forward, the ones who didn't learned it the hard way. But eventually, the lesson was learned. Sometimes the best way to win is to fight like you're not there at all.